We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dr. Wilmer Leon. In the wake of some of the most powerful hurricanes on record and historic wildfires in California, the Trump administration's strategy on climate, try to bury its own scientific report on global warming, is the approach that they're taking. The Trump White House, which has defined itself by a willingness to dismiss scientific findings and propose its own facts, last Friday issued a scientific report that directly contradicts its own global warming policies. So what's going on here? For insight, we turn to my next guest. He's a former physicist who writes out his analysis of physical or societal problems or interactions. He joins us to discuss his latest counterpunch piece, Climate Change Action Would Kill Imperialism. Manuel Garcia Jr., welcome to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to your counterpunch piece, Climate Change Action Would Kill Imperialism, your thoughts on the stories from Friday and today that the Trump administration has released this report but is now in either due to hypocrisy or schizophrenia, it is contradicting itself.
Well, I don't think there's anything unusual about that in terms of the Trump administration. The business community, really worldwide, has understood climate change is real for a long time. But of course, to actually act on it would undermine their whole economic activity, self-aggrandizing activity. So you have, on the one hand, the obfuscation for the public to keep them, as it were, buying and on the tether, while on the other hand, they themselves are very seriously taking climate change into account and working on it. For example, just recently, the American government decided to underwrite the cost of building seawalls along the Gulf Coast of Texas to protect oil refineries that they are worried about being inundated by the rising level of the sea because of climate change. So, deep down, they know what's going on, and they're just playing the usual game that people play of trying to keep their advantages and keep everybody else confused and befuddled.
Before I get into a little more detail about this 1,600-page national climate assessment, let me ask your assessment as a physicist about building these seawalls to deal with global warming. Does building these seawalls actually make some sense?
Well, okay. Let's put it this way. It makes sense from a insane point of view. For example,
I like that.
Some time ago, in the Obama administration already, when the Arctic ice was less Arctic ice, there was this frenzy of the petroleum industry, helped by the government, was saying, well, great, now we can rush into the Arctic and pump oil year round because we can put wells in, sea wells in,
sure,
because there's less ice. So, the logic there is that what we're doing is causing CO2 in the atmosphere, which is melting the Arctic and causing climapocalypse, as I call it, and, coming toward us. So what could be better than the climapocalypse that we're creating is making it easier for us to do more of it. And so it's the same thing. I mean, you have these refineries. There's a huge concentration of refineries along the Gulf Coast. And what do? They refine now the pumped down, tar sands, the oil shale, and they refine this stuff. What are we going to do? They're going to burn it, and we're going to keep the old system going, and it's going to, it's causing the problem we all understand here in this segment. And so, what would be the logical thing to do? Well, the logical thing to do, from the keep making money perspective, is to protect those things so we can keep pumping out more CO2 so we can kill ourselves, by climate change. I mean, that's why I say it's logical from an insane point of view. The aspect of it that rankles, at least me and other people, is that they're using taxpayer money to protect the industry that is, in large part, creating the problem that is killing us all. And so another way of using the taxpayer money would be for a wider public interest to say, look, why don't we, for instance, take a few $1 trillion and do an infrastructure program, the kind that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has championed, and put a lot of people to work and create tons of green energy systems, which are not that complicated, really. And we didn't need so much fossil fuel. We could spew out less of it and even invest in some speculative technology now for extracting it out of the atmosphere. And so there's that aspect of it. So that's the direction from which I come.
Let me just explain to the audience that the report that we're talking about, the National Climate Assessment, a 1,656-page report, which is required by Congress, is the most comprehensive. I'm just letting my audience understand.
Oh, yes, I understand.
It's the most comprehensive scientific study to date, detailing the effects of global warming on the United States economy, public health, coastlines, and infrastructure. And it describes in precise detail how the warming planet will wreak hundreds of billions of dollars of damage in coming decades. I know that President Trump has questioned the science, but as a physicist, and I'm sorry if this is a silly question, but just to kind of put the stake in the ground.
Yes.
How exact is this global warming science that the Trump administration and other conservatives want to refute?
Well, okay. I've actually written about that. Let me very briefly just give you a quick history.
Okay.
The idea of CO2 global warming was realized by a physicist called Arrhenius in the 1890s. It was championed by papers written by an American woman physicist in the 20s and 30s who was not recognized until recently. And in the 30s, British scientists revived Arrhenius' research and published on it. And in 1955, in the journal Nature, the definitive article doing a complete scientific, A to Z on climate change, global warming being caused by CO2 emission, by human activity, was published in Nature. In 1957, in the journal TELUS, T-E-L-U-S, Tell Us, the two authors who had done that critical research published a joint paper that described it. In 1962, I happen to own a copy of his wonderful book on aerodynamics written by a British industrial physicist.
Okay.
And it was published in 1962.
Okay.
In 1962, and in it, it states that we know that, human activity, burning of coal, puts CO2 in the atmosphere, and the Earth is warming, and they give estimates of that.
Okay. All right.
As we know, in 88, Hansen came out with a statement. So we've known about this for a long time.
Long time.
A long time.
Okay.
And it's, there's, it's kind of like, is the Earth flat? Or
I was just going to say, we know two things. We know the Earth we know the world is round.
Right.
And we know that it's warming. And we know that it's warming because of human activity. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, the questioning of it is it's ridiculous.
Okay. And, folks, we're talking to Manuel Garcia Jr., a physicist who writes on physical and social problems. And we're talking now about his latest piece, Climate Change. Climate change action would kill imperialism. And that, I think your analysis here is amazing to me. American political power is based on fossil fuels, and the U.S. military is the engine that consumes those fuels to produce that power. So long as there's an American political elite that craves lucrative personal prestige and the ability to dominate internationally, the U.S. economy will be fossil-fueled capitalism that maintains the military colossus that enables and protects those elite ambitions. You talk about imperial power in two varieties. explain first the hard power, then the soft power, please.
Well, I mean, I see it as you say, a hard power. Hard power is what most people think of as military power. You know, the U.S. has this military ability to invade, like Iraq, invade Afghanistan, to control territory, to put soldiers, boots on the ground, tanks, bomb from our airplanes, basically take over territory. And our Navy can monopolize or guard sea lanes that, for instance, to protect them from piracy or pirates or other nations who would predate on tanker traffic. So, for example, the U.S. Navy, some estimates are that the amount of money the U.S. spends on its military to guard the sea lanes in the Strait of Hormuz and Suez,
yes,
and all of that is equivalent to it's huge. I mean, it's huge. So that's what I mean by hard power.
And we know, for example, that China on the other side, their Navy out in the South China Sea, they are they are protecting those sea lanes, not necessarily to protect oil traffic, but between their Belt and Road Initiative and their Made in China 2025, they want to be sure that they're able to use those sea lanes to ship their products and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, there's also a lot of speculation about oil deposits near the Spratly Islands and all of that. So everybody's playing these games. Everybody's military. And then the other aspect you asked about the
soft power, yes.
The soft power, I view that as, well, we have this military colossus. I mean, other countries have too, China, but the U.S. has this military colossus. And the soft power is, for example, all these arms sales. We sell arms to Israel, and that enables them to do their little mini imperialism in their area, which is consistent with U.S. aims of regional control. And, for example, the obvious one is the huge arms sales we do to Saudi Arabia, which enable them to, bomb the Yemenis genocidally and have their control. But the thing about arms sales is, if you want to go back into history, you can read about the satraps, the client kings of the Persian Empire. But the idea is that, the superpower tells a lesser power, here, we're going to give you the armaments you need to, maintain the sphere of influence you want to maintain. And out of gratitude to us, you're going to do us a few favors. And among the favors the U.S. likes to get from the opulent Saudi royalty are things like keep the production of oil high, because low oil prices result, and we like that for greasing our capitalism. And also, here, undercutting the price of oil does things like undercut the Venezuelan socialism, which is relying on their fossil fuel sales to try to
save their economy,
do economic development in their country. And places like Iran. Iran sells fossil fuels also. I mean, all these things are causing global warming, but still, poorer countries that happen to have this highly desired resource are stuck between, are we going to sit here and not globally warm and let our people starve to death? We're going to sell it on the open market, use the money and try to do economic development in our nation, and then maybe eventually evolve or develop technology that can get us away from it. Which is why the Iranians actually wanted to have nuclear power, because they viewed the oil they had as something to sell, to bring money into the country, to raise the economic standards, and then use nuclear power to sustain themselves without having to rely on the oil. Not that I like nuclear power, but I'm just explaining that that's the aspect of soft power. The U.S. can use its ability to induce, sell, or propel the militarism elsewhere as, in client regime sort of style.
Well, so it's also, we only have a couple minutes. It's also important when you talk about Iran and nuclear power to understand the Atoms for Peace program back in the 50s. It was the United States that introduced. So it's just an interesting cycle that Iran can have nuclear power, but we're the ones that initially back in the 50s tried to sell it to them. So Westinghouse could sell nuclear reactors all around the world.
Yes, there's a whole thing about nuclear power, that we could go off it forever on that.
Let me quickly get to this because I found this point that you made to be incredibly powerful. You say because of the fracking oil shale boom of the last 2 decades, the U.S. now produces as much oil as Saudi Arabia and is energy independent as a fossil-fueled economy, but hegemonic ambition compels it to seek global control of petroleum distribution because to control the flow of oil around the globe is to throttle the imperial ambitions and economic development plans of all others. And to your point early in the conversation about why we're not moving towards green forms of energy, that paragraph that you just wrote, I thought was incredibly profound and incredibly powerful.
Well, I hope it stimulates some thinking with more people.
And because, to your point, as you mentioned earlier, there's so much residual impact that could come from green technology investment that to continue to drill these holes in the ground is a waste of resources.
I've always, actually, I was in graduate school in the 70s during the first oil crisis, during the Carter administration. And one of the things I realized then was that, the petroleum we have, we can think of it as a stopgap. What we should have done, back in 73 and on, 79, 73, 79, the years of that crisis, what we should have done was to say, look, we've got a temporary resource of energy, these fossil fuels. Use them to power the building of an alternative green energy system. Because the green energy systems, we're talking solar, hydro, and wind. These things were known from way back, okay?
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's nothing really new about it except modern technology and computers can do them maybe more efficiently. But the essential parts of it, the physical parts of it, are ancient. And so we could have built a huge system that would have powered the country. Let me give you a statistic that may surprise you. If we took solar energy, solar power, we collected solar power on 1% of the land area of the United States of America and converted it with only 2% efficiency to electricity, that would power the entire electrical energy use of the United States, 4 trillion kilowatt hours per year.
Wow.
So, you could take a fraction of the state of Arizona and put solar energy farms and power all the power that is used electrically in this country. It's not going to power airplanes and tanks, but it powers the grid, and we can plug in anything you can plug in. So the other aspect of this is that if there is more than enough land, public land owned by the U.S. government in warm areas and any sunny area to do this, so it is theoretically possible for the U.S. government to do solar energy farms on totally federal-owned land and collect enough energy to give the country free electricity without having to have any utilities or any cost whatsoever because it's a public investment.
And then these things are possible. These things
are physically possible. They're not pie in the sky.
Got it.
And then you look at something like the Sahara Desert. You can put energy farms across that and power, even maybe Europe could tap into the power and pay for it with enough to give Africa tremendous development further south.
I got to stop you there. Manuel Garcia Jr., Climate Change Action Would Kill Imperialism. You'll find it in Counterpunch. It's a great piece. Sir, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate you coming to the Critical Hour. Look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks, you are listening to the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dr. Wilmer Leon. There is more on the other side. Stay tuned.